All right, and it's another Wednesday, and Wednesday on Moya is Black Wednesdays, where we look at South African history so that we know what brought us to where we are today. As usual, our host, that is Steve Lebelo, is going to take us into the history. Thank you to everybody who joins in every single Wednesday. We are trying to build this section so that when the white people start with their because guys, so when they start we must be able to answer good to know at this point this happened and then this happened and this happened. So it's important for us to know our own history. So I don't want to waste any of your time. Thank you for liking, sharing, and subscribing. I'm going to hand over to our elder, and that is Steve Lebelo, who's a historian and who's been taking us on this journey of Black Wednesdays. Please do check out the other episodes in the live stream section so that you can catch up, because we've been going a few weeks now, and we're now around, we're headed towards the 80s. We're going to learn about Mama Maki Skosana today. For those who don't know, she was the first victim of necklacing, and we're going to learn all about that. That is Steve. Good evening.
Good evening, again. Good evening to the viewers.
Thank you so much for joining us as usual, and I'm going to hand the mic to you now.
Okay, thanks, Nsiki. I think, just some opening remarks about maybe just an overview, of what the purpose of the series is. The issue here is that, Black radicalism is a kind of an instrument of mobilization. It is an instrument of mass mobilization, and this is what it had been, throughout the 20th century. I think there's a sense of kind of a transition that happens around 1960, from mass mobilization as an instrument against what we often refer to as colonial apartheid. And there was that transition to armed struggle. And that tended to suggest that armed struggle becomes a higher form of engagement with colonial apartheid. And the history of that is well documented. Roughly it is in fact the history of MK and APLA, from 1961, right down to 1991, in that 30-year period. That is the kind of radicalism that generally, we are quite familiar with. But over the years, Black radicalism has actually been a subject of condemnation, in South Africa and elsewhere, wherever it manifests itself. And in the case of South Africa, it is important to understand that in certain senses, historically, South Africa is a settler society, despite the fact that the Freedom Charter, suggests otherwise. But essentially, we regard South Africa as historically, as a kind of a settler society. And it is in that context that you would expect, a kind of a Black radicalism to thrive. And yet, Black radicalism has not thrived at all, in the South African context. You will realize as we go along that my assertion here is that Black Wednesday is very significant in accounting for the fate of Black radicalism throughout the 20th century. But P.W. Botha also becomes central in any discussion about the fate of Black radicalism and what happened to it. I can understand why today, I can refer to historical moments, which were the manifestations of either Black radical thought or a kind of activity that is often associated with Black radical thinking. And people cannot relate to this, as Black radical activism. That is simply because, and this is something that we have to understand. Like I said, so much investment went into the eradication of Black radicalism, both in the popular consciousness of people, as well as in academic, in the academic terrain. Not only did this actually happen in the streets of black townships in the 1980s, just about everything that unfolded was in fact a systematic assault on what black radicalism would have stood for. The fate of Maki Skosana, and we shall build up, it is important for us to understand, the 6 to 8 years that went into the eradication of black radical thought, leading up to 1985, when Maki Skosana was actually necklaced. This was not, an event that came out of the blue. This was a culmination of a process in which the apartheid state was responding specifically to the character of the mass mobilization of the 1970s. So far, I think I have, highlighted a few of those events. Going over them again in detail is not going to help. But I just want to single out a few, 3 important events that changed the way white society thought about black people in the period, June up to December 1976. The long and the short of it is that it is during this period, that the mass mobilization of the 1970s actually erupted into a mass uprising. It is particularly between June and December. A couple of things happened. I spoke about the fact that what was foregrounded, in telling the narrative of June 16 was victimhood. It was Hector Peterson. But there was Melville Edelstein, who was also brutally murdered. Now, I really want this to be understood. It was in the interest of white, apartheid securocrats, to play down the murder, because that was the brutal murder of Edelstein. It was in their interest to play it down for the simple reason that white society had to continue to invest, in the impregnability of the apartheid state's security apparatus. They had to have confidence in the fact that they will be secured against a black rage that was beginning to build up. This is why for the past 40 years, every June 16, it is Hector Peterson we talk about. We hardly ever mention Edelstein. That was the purpose at the time. The purpose was to play down, Edelstein and play, the victimhood of Hector Peterson. But, in a sense, I always argue that discarding historical facts that are of such significance may be good for, for propaganda. It is actually good propaganda. Black people don't kill white people. It's good for propaganda, but it is bad for record keeping. The result is that, younger people today hardly have any idea of who Edelstein was or what the impact of his death on white society would have been. But then Edelstein was just one white individual, who got caught up in that situation. And most people would say it was a spontaneous reaction on the part of the 3 young men who were ultimately fingered as responsible for his death. But here is another, instance of history being shoved under the carpet. Up to this day, it would be difficult to remember who the 3 people who were fingered as responsible for the death of Edelstein were. You ask any Sowetan if they knew who the guys were, I guess, few people remember what their fate would have been. We do know that at some point there may have been a trial going on, but what the outcome of that trial was is something, that collectively, we were made to forget. But then you get to December 1976. I spoke about this. I spoke about Wellington Chazibani and the impact that he would have had on the political landscape. But what we haven't discussed is how did this actually impact on white society? Now, up until December 1976, it became clear that, this is a kind of an uprising or a kind of an insurrection, that actually involved Black people alone, exclusively. The concern in white society, and particularly in the security establishment, was that each of the events that took place were actually conceived, planned, and executed by Black people to the exclusion of any other non-African group. And that was particularly concerning. The reaction to that was really to work harder, in the time between January and April 1977, to infiltrate the most important, section of the mass movement at the time. And that was the student movement. If you think about it, it is the high school students who kept the momentum going after June 16, 1976. But also it is important to remember, that when the exiled formations were recruiting, were being revitalized, it was the high school students who were at the center of that revitalization process. So it therefore makes sense that the white establishment would be particularly concerned, about what was happening in Soweto's high schools and also in other high schools, say in Pretoria, in Atteridgeville and Mamelodi, because these were the centers, of the uprising at the time. So it is in that period between January and April that the white liberals managed to infiltrate the Soweto Students' Representative Council. The concern, as I say, was that if this mass movement of the 1970s was going to continue, white participation in particular, had to be provided for, if you like, which is why the liberals reacted in the way that they did. Somehow they did manage to infiltrate the student movement. And I did explain the last time out that the long and the short of it is that the entire SSRC executive was arrested when they had the very first meeting with the SRC of Wits University, as well as some students, who were members of the National Union of Students in South Africa, which was a white, kind of university student formation, one that Biko explicitly condemned as being part of the oppressive system of Black people and walked away from it. Now, the point here I'm making is that just in terms of the white imaginary, by April 1977, it was clear that the problem here was to deal with a Black radical mass movement. Now, what actually substantiates that is something that I picked up, which was conversations and discourses, going on in the South African Parliament at the time, in the National Assembly. And, at the forefront of attacking the National Party was one said de Villiers Graaf. And it is in his speeches that one is able to read, what the mood was in white society at this time. It is out of those speeches that one can make sense, of the fact that white society, was very spooked, by what was actually happening in the Black townships, not only in Soweto, but also in other parts of Gauteng at the time. We have to bear in mind here that in South Africa, it is a tendency of engagements, with colonial apartheid, that you have an epicenter, from where an activity will happen and it will radiate outside. So this may well have been, a kind of an event that happened in Gauteng's Black townships, but its impact reverberated across the country. Because what we are talking about here is not only a kind of a political expression, but this has got, deep psychological effects. on what would have been black-white relationships at the time. So the political discourse in white society is more a search for safety and security as 1977 proceeds. And again, within a year, the Nationalist Party is actually facing an election. And it has to show some kind of grit, and demonstrate that it is going to deal with this black mass mobilization of the 1970s. The first thing that they do in July, as I said, was, to dismiss Chief of Police in Soweto, who was actually held responsible for the failure of the system, of the state, to deal with this mass unrest. And he was actually dismissed and replaced. But here is the most important thing. It is that there was hope that with the entire executive of the SSRC behind bars, the student movement would therefore be completely neutralized. But during that period, the SSRC was able to reconfigure itself into a new force, and Mashinini took over as president of the SSRC. Now, this actually really made the apartheid securocrats even more restless. And the violence that was unleashed during the latter half of July 1977 and throughout August was quite unthinkable. Now, if you go to the Apartheid Museum, we have put up, and I'm saying we because I was part of the team that actually did this, we have put up an entire panel that, illustrates and explain, the kind of violence that was happening in Soweto between April and Black Wednesday in October. And part of that is actually showing, how the canine unit was used to great effect, to at least put a stall to, the kind of student activism that was happening at the time. But I think, the final blow was actually the green car. And if you go to Hector Peterson, I have a few inscriptions describing what was happening at this stage. And this is going into the 1st of September or September 1977. And yet again, another hammer blow is delivered on the Black radical tradition. This time it is the state taking over all the high schools in Soweto and beginning to run them. That put an end to any student activism. But then Biko was killed on the 12th. So the point here I'm making is that white society was actually searching for, some very strong arm that could deal with the Black mass mobilization of the 1970s. So what actually catapults P.W. Botha to power in 1978? It is not the information scandal, as historians want us to believe. It is actually the fact that he was seen as the one capable to put, and actually he made that promise. It was on the basis of that promise that he was actually made first the leader of the National Party, and, then he would become prime minister in 1978. At some point, we are going to have to cover the information scandal, because the information scandal becomes instrumental as well in this concerted effort, both in the state and probably even in other white powerful interests.
That is Steve.
Hi, man.
Can you break it down for us now? The information scandal.
Oh, but okay. Yeah, let me do that because it is important. The genesis of the information scandal is actually in an event that happened in 1977 in Springs. There was an assassination of a National Party MP in Springs, and they investigated. It actually became a cold case, and the people behind it couldn't be found. But at some point, when the info scandal actually broke, there were suspicions that Smith, and that's the MP, the National Party MP, that Smith was assassinated because he was about to reveal, certain, scandals about the Department of Information.
Can I ask a question? Sorry to disturb you, Ukolo.
Yes.
Is this connected to why they killed Verwoerd? Because we don't
No,
know what.
no, Verwoerd
Okay.
was 10 years earlier, but this is in 77, 78. You know, that's when it happens.
Okay, what exactly is the information scandal? What when you say that, what is that?
This is what I'm explaining, that the genesis would have been that assassination. And this had to do with a scandal in the Department of Information. The Department of Information under B.J. Foster, P.W. Botha's predecessor. It was under Foster's watch that the info scandal actually happened. Let me quickly explain what this actually entailed. In part, the information scandal was actually the Department of Information's response, or the government's response, to the events of June 16, 1976 and 1977. We talked about Hector Peterson and the fact that that image went global. Today we'd say it went viral, but it went global. And that actually tarnished South Africa's image abroad. So the Department of Information was given what we call today a slush fund, a lot of money that was used to clean up South Africa's image abroad. Among other things that the Department of Information did was to buy publications, which publications were going to run stories that would tell good stories about South Africa. In Europe and in the US, there was one publication that was bought in the US, a weekly newspaper. But in France, they actually bought a magazine called Le Monde. And that magazine was running stories about South Africa. That money came from the Department of Information. Back in South Africa, they had their own publications as well. One that you will know is the Citizen newspaper. It was actually set up by the Department of Information as a kind of, propaganda instrument, cleaning up the National Party mess inside South Africa. That was the one publication. The other was a magazine that you will also be familiar with. It was Pace Magazine. Pace Magazine was bought with the purpose of actually, if anything, undermining the Soweto Students' Representative Council. Pace Magazine ran a number of exclusive interviews with Tsitsi Mashinini. At some point, I'm going to have to give a full detail of what actually happened between Tsitsi Mashinini and Pace Magazine. It actually involved people that Soweto people would be familiar with. Alf Kumalo was the photographer, and Lucas Mulite was actually writing the stories. The long and the short of it is that when Seiko went into Congress in 1979, Tsitsi had already been sidelined from the student movement, precisely because of the articles that were run by Pace inside South Africa at the time, which were not so much favorable for the student movement outside the country. But I will need to give more detail on that because, Pace was quite instrumental, inside lining Tsitsi from the student movement. And Khotso took over. That's why Khotso became president in 1979. But that is what Pace Magazine was doing. And then also the Department of Information bought a house in Soweto. And that house was given to a Soweto socialite. Projects that would have, projected the National Party in a positive light. The socialite's name was Leslie Sihume, and his name too was dragged into the info scandal mess. Now, on the National Party side, the people who were involved with the info scandal is the ancestor of this Connie Melville, who is leader of the Freedom Vryheids Front. I think it is either his uncle or his grandfather who was minister at the time, also Connie Melville. That was his name. But there were two brothers who were quite instrumental, who were playing the role of facilitating all of these things within the Department of Information. And the one most instrumental is one called Eshel Rudy. Now, I'm sure the viewers may want to, Google these names and find out what their roles were. But that is what the information scandal was about. It was about cleaning up, South Africa globally, just in terms of the damage that was done, by the Hector Peterson picture being circulated around the globe. But it was also working hard to sanitize the National Party inside South Africa. And no doubt, P.W. Botha let that come out in the open, just to undermine B.J. Foster. So this is the reason why, historians would look at the information scandal and argue that that was responsible for Foster's downfall. That may well be the case, but what was responsible for PW's rise is something else. It is his promise that he will deal with the Black radical mass movement of the 1970s. So the fact that we can talk about the Black radical tradition in South Africa today and seem to be talking about, something from outer space is understandable. A great deal went into the eradication of Black thought. And that is what the 1980s were about. That is what, the necklacing of Maki Skosana was about. It was striking a blow against the Black radical tradition. And we will come to that. We will come to the build-up, that leads, to that kind of brutal violence being unleashed against a Black woman. The beginning of that violence, again, it's going to be important here. Often than not, we are told that the violence actually began in 1984. Again, Tsiki, let me remind the viewers here that yes, 1984 was would be the beginning of what at West we used to call the popular violence of the 1980s. Yes, it started in the Vaal townships of Sebokeng and Sharpeville. But that is because people overlook yet another important event, that took place exactly a year before the eruption in Sharpeville and Sebokeng. And that was the Ngoye massacre. Now, between 1978, when P.W. Botha becomes prime minister, and the Ngoye massacre, what we are looking at there is the systematic assault, on Black radical thinking and also on Black radical forms of political mobilization. Because what we get into the 1980s, is it is the kind of an illusion of struggle that is being created. It is an illusion that is created around a concept, that I think is fraudulent, particularly in the South African context. And that concept is non-racialism. I know last week, the question came up, what is racism? What is non-racialism? I have been flagellating myself all week that I probably did not attend to that question, quite fairly, but that was because it was at the end of the episode. It is important, but also, I think I was actually comforted by the ways in which people responded to the Washington White House drama last week. What I said non-racialism is in the South African context, or that non-racialism arises when a Black man is absent even when they are present, and the white man is present even when they are absent. I know that sounded like very facetious, but from what I gathered, I didn't actually see, the happenings in the White House last week. But quite clearly, from the African diaspora, the sense is that it was precisely that, the Black, kind of representation was absent even though it was present. And it's not me saying so. This is what the Black world saw of what happened last week, and that, the white representative was, present even when they were absent. And in this case, the absent white representative would have to be Helen Zille herself, because she's most definitely seemed to have had quite a robust presence, even though she wasn't there. This is the idea. This is, the idea of what non-racialism is, because it arises in a situation where you really have to decimate the Black identity. And it is only in that context that non-racialism actually works. But this is not something of recent times, in South African politics. If you go back to the 1950s, what was the reason for the formation of the PAC? It was precisely that. I mean, there were a number of reasons why, some of those Africanists walked away from the ANC. But the most important reason here was that, and I always say this, that decision-making processes passed from Africans to non-Africans. And that in itself was worrying, to Africanist people inside the ANC at that time. For those who probably, listened to Mbuyiseni Ndlozi on Power FM, you will have heard former President Thabo Mbeki, talking about the Pan-Africanism of the ANC as a historical phenomenon. That becomes problematic, precisely because the formation of the PAC had to do with the fact that, the ANC was probably, or the mainstream ANC, was watering down, the kind of radicalism that they wanted, to reflect. But here is an issue here. The issue here is that, or the claim here is that it is Pan-Africanist, that the ANC was Pan-Africanist. That may well be true. If we understand Pan-Africanism to be a kind of political activism that embraces, the entire African continent, that becomes, Pan-Africanism. But is that, can that be equated to Black radicalism? The answer is no. One can be Pan-Africanist without being Black radical. And this is the issue. That's the distinction that we need to make. Botha would have been Black radical first and probably Pan-Africanist. But what was crucial and defining about Botha was its character as a Black radical formation. Now, here is a scenario that one can think about. You can have a Hastings Banda in Malawi and become a political activist in South Africa in the 1970s. If you embrace Banda in Malawi, you may actually claim to be Pan-Africanist, but you surely cannot claim to be a Black radical, because a Banda in Malawi is no different from a Lucas Mangope in South Africa in the 1970s. You may well be Pan-Africanist, but you can never be a Black radical. I'm struggling here to try and explain the distinction, between the kind of political tradition that South Africans have been open to and the Black radical tradition, which was completely decimated because it was in the interest of powerful, it is powerful interests, self-serving interests that wanted to see the end of Black radical thinking at all. And I'm going to come back to Maki Skosana and say that is the moment that one could say, it became almost unthinkable that the Black radical tradition could ever be revived. But we shall come back to it. So when P.W. Botha comes in 1978, this is the scenario at hand. It is the fact that, forms of Black mass mobilization are actually problematic, not only for the apartheid state securocrats, and also for supporters of the Nationalist Party, but it is also of utmost concern to white South African liberals, whom we define almost all the time as the English-speaking segment of South African white society. They too were particularly concerned about this, which is why you had the liberal infiltration of the student movement when it happened, early in 1977. So when P.W. Botha comes in, he comes in to deal specifically with this issue. What we are going to be seeing here is a kind of institutional rearrangement, of the public sphere. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the ways in which the high schools were subjected to a systematic attack, so that, in the 1980s, you do not have the kind of a high school that could generate, the kinds of students of the caliber of Botha and Tsitsi Mashinini. So you will see how, in the 1980s, there was a complete reimagination of the ways in which the high schools were going to look like. And how was this actually achieved? You will see also that the caliber and character of the teaching personnel actually becomes, the concern of the apartheid securocrats, and they work on that too. I know it is pretty hard to think that they could have done something, with the student body, but they did that as well. And I'm going to explain the ways in which apartheid securocrats, penetrated the high schools and actually influenced developments, particularly from 1981 to 1984, when that mass mobilization actually erupted. Last week, I just made an offhand comment and said, when the Soweto Students' League was formed, because it was attached to AZAPO, a black radical political formation, it was crushed, with all the determination that was available to the state security apparatus, and that they went to Bloemfontein, and we talked about what happened in Bloemfontein. But I also made this, comment that COSAS was established in 1979, and it was allowed. The issue here is that it was allowed to continue well into the 1990s, probably up to 1991. And that in that sense, it was vetted. And here you see the difference. Apartheid state securocrats could actually deal or work or tolerate, a kind of student formation whose blueprint for liberation is the Freedom Charter, because COSAS adopted the Freedom Charter at its formation. But they couldn't, tolerate a black radical student movement. It had to be dealt with and crushed completely. So the high school terrain was dealt with as part of the systematic assault, on black forms of mass mobilization in the 1970s. And it is P.W. Botha now, who is executing this kind of grand plan. The universities are very interesting. And I think I'm going to have to take, a separate, kind of episode here to look at what happens in the universities, particularly between 1979 and 1984, in that 4-year period. And again here, something quite dramatic actually happens. And it explains why there was a massacre at Ngoye University in 1983. It is a culmination of, yet again, a kind of social engineering that was taking place in the universities. And, it culminated in that massacre at the University of Zululand in 1983. And I would argue that rather than look at 1984, the Val townships, as the beginning of the popular violence, it will best be understood if we extend the timeline a year earlier and start with the Ngoye massacre of 1983. And somewhere down the line, we are going to put all of this into context. So that is what happened in the universities. Last week, I actually talked about the UBC. Again, I was under the impression that we all understand what the UBC was. But then I became aware The UBC, as I explained, was the urban Bantu councils, and these were local government structures before 1976. They were still there in August 1977, and they were still part of, what we call the system at the time. We had tolerated them, up until then. But then, August 1977, there was a sense that these, structures have to dissolve. This is important to understand. The reason, I'm trying to spend a little time on this one is because 7 years later, precisely the same kind of conflict, is what leads to violence in Sharpeville and in Sebokeng. And it was for the same kind of reasons, removing local government structures that were established by the apartheid state. So the UBCs, were also local government structures that were answerable to the apartheid state. And if they were still in existence in August 1977, it was an aberration that had to be dealt with. But how was it dealt with? Again, I go back to this relationship between the generations. The Mayor Tolika Makaya was a parent, and all the councillors were parents. But we, just in terms of their politics were antagonistic to the well-being of the community, and that's how we saw it. So they were actually approached and asked to dissolve the UBC and resign themselves, which they did. The event actually took place at Madibane High School. And I think this is the one example that Rafomo Sono, who was president of the SSRC at the time, was able to set. It was a brilliant example of what I always, and I think I've said this quite often, also in relation to Credo Mutua, and I really want this to be understood, that what actually drove the mass movement of the 1970s was not to pursue political goals that required violence visited upon Black bodies. That is not what the mass movement was about. But it was the mass movement of the 1980s that seemed to consider Black bodies as low-hanging fruit, in their expression, of the rage against apartheid. And that distinction has to be made. The UBC people, put in their resignations, and UBC was dissolved. But 7 years later, P.W. Botha had reconstituted the UBCs. And at first they called the department responsible the Department of Plural Affairs. But they felt, maybe no, this is rather offensive. They then called it the Department of Community Development. And the minister became, an idiot of an Afrikaner called Piet Korenhoff. And Piet Korenhoff became that minister. If you think about it, it was the idiocy of Piet Korenhoff that led to the outbreak of violence, in 1984, because that violence was concentrated around issues that had to do with local government. It was issues of people being, taken out of their homes because they were not paying rent. There were issues of, exorbitant rent hikes that people could not afford. But more than anything else, there were issues about the rise of a new political elite of councillors, who were appropriating all the township businesses to themselves, to their friends, and to their families. Hence the intensity of the violence that was directed against the councillors. If you think about it, the one event that actually stands out about, the violence of 1984, particularly in Sebokeng and Sharpeville, was the Sharpeville 6 trial. And if people want to get the details of what happened on the day was the 4th of September, 1983. It was quite brutal. But I'm trying to show the contrast here, that 7 years down the line, the paradigm has shifted so much that it was justifiable. it was politically validated, to visit violence on other Black people in pursuit of a political objective. That became a very, critical difference. Now, we have talked about the social engineering, I just pointed it out, that there was social engineering in the universities, which also would have been another location of the mass movement of the 1970s. Tiro himself came out of Tefliop, and Tefliop was in turmoil, during this period. The third would actually be the workplace. If you think about it, the workplace was also drawn into the mass movement of the 1970s. We spoke about the stayaways, and I don't think we have really talked about the impact of the stayaways on employers and on white colleagues, vis-a-vis their Black colleagues. No doubt, there was a change of relationship here, from understanding, the Black workers as the kind that would be taken by one policeman, riding on a bicycle to the police station and doing nothing about it, simply because he was enforcing past laws. That docile African ceased to exist, at least in the minds of white society at this time. And if you think about it, the Chazibane affair, we haven't talked about it. Historians have said nothing about it. But the reality here is that it certainly did affect white society and its sense of security until that point. So, yes, it is in that context that P.W. Botha comes in, so that even the workplaces are actually affected by the kind of thing that was happening. But let's start with the high schools and see what actually happens here to deal with the mass mobilization of the 1970s. Although it is all students, in Soweto and probably in Atteridgeville and Mamelodi, who participated, in that mass movement. There would be high schools that were specifically identified as more troublesome than others. Maurice Isaacson, Naledi Orlando High School, as well as Madiban High School, each would have produced, very prominent leaders of the SSRC. And in the mind of the securocrats, those are the high schools that were supposed to be targeted. In the 1980s, these high schools were reduced to nothing, To start with, in 1978, all of them were only allowed to operate on 2 grades. What was Form 1 at the time and Form 4. What it actually meant is that the whole mass of students who were in these high schools in 77, when the schools shut down, could never go back to school. Now, that was actually engineering a whole new body of students, who were going to be going into the high schools. The second thing that they did was, while they were destroying the old high schools and making them irrelevant, they were creating a whole layer of new high schools, and these were given some kind of different architecture. They were multi-story buildings, and you can see them all over the place. The interesting thing is that they were also given some exotic Latin names, such as Fons Luminus, Veritas, Fidelitas, Anchor. Now, the idea here, this was an institutional attack on the mass movement of the 1970s. It was actually destroying or decimating the institutional memory that the student of the 1980s would have had of the students of the 1970s. So that by 1981, you had a caliber of student in the high schools who did not know anything about what was happening in Soweto in 1976-77. And this was quite deliberate on the part of the apartheid securocrats, but it worked. It worked because a new and different kind of student body was actually emerging, a student body that had actually adopted the Freedom Charter as a blueprint for liberation. And that student body was COSAS. Now, like I said, COSAS was established both in Port Elizabeth and in Soweto before it spread to other parts of the country. And it is in these two that a declaration was made that COSAS was going to adopt the Freedom Charter. But in Soweto, the first action that COSAS took, had to do with, an attack on Credo Muta, but we have talked about this. The issue here again, is that, as I pointed out earlier, the workplace became another area, that was dealt with by the apartheid securocrats. Now, what emerges in 1981 is a new kind of struggle. Even before 1984, even before the eruption in the Vaal. By then already, the masses are mobilized around a completely different, issue here. The struggle is beginning to happen around the workplace. What you have is the emergence of new trade unions. Now, here is something that we need to understand. The idea of trade unions re-emerging in South Africa in 1981 is the result of a commission of inquiry. That commission of inquiry was the Weehan Commission. And the Weehan suggested that two things have to happen, to be able to contain future mass mobilization. The first he suggested was that scrap the influx control regulations and allow a greater mobility of labor into PWV area, today Gauteng. That was the first recommendation from the Weehan Commission. The second recommendation was that legalize the trade unions. So by 1981, trade unions had been legalized. By 1982, the National Union of Mine Workers is actually established. So what I'm saying here is that from the mass movement of the 1970s, the first kind of activism, happens to be in the workplaces, and the trade unions are in the forefront of this new political activism from as early as 1981. And you have work stoppages across the country in Cape Town, and they spread to Johannesburg and to the East Rand, Germiston, Benoni, and other parts of the Witwatersrand. Now, all of these are in the food and beverage industries mainly. That's where the work stoppages are happening. But the paradigm here gets to be different. The antagonism is no longer, as was the case in the mass movement of the 1970s, where the antagonism was between black and white, and that was made pretty clear. Go back to, the ways in which Wellington Chazibani emerges. Wellington Chazibani plotted to detonate explosives inside a crowded whites-only restaurant. That was actually explicitly targeting white people. And that is what generated a great deal of fear, that would have led to, a search for safety and security. So that kind of antagonism is being played down completely. I'm not saying black radicalism, finds expression in violence. That issue is an issue that needs to be addressed, but it is blatantly clear that, black radicalism more often than not would be accompanied by violence directed against the white body, if one may put it that way. Botha is a perfect example of this. But we really need to have a separate discussion about the place of violence in the black radical tradition. It is not to be taken for granted, that the black radical tradition embraces violence, but it has to be understood that violence is a contested, phenomenon, even within the black radical tradition. But the point that I'm making here, is that the new kind of struggle that was taking place from 1981 was in fact a massive paradigm shift, from the kind of struggle that was taking place in the 1970s. And this again was deliberate. The most important thing here was to deal was was to deal with the Black radical tradition. The idea here was to create a new kind of radicalism that would counter the Black radical tradition. But what was this new, kind of radicalism? It is clear, that trade union activism is actually based a great deal on the Marxist-Leninist, kind of thinking. So it is, in fact, the Marxist-Leninist, kind of radical tradition that is actually being used to displace the Black radical tradition in the mobilization of Black people against colonial apartheid. And this begins to happen very early on in the 1980s. By 1981-82, you have a great deal of, work stoppages, which are beginning to take center stage. And you may well ask, what is happening to AZAPO at this time? Am I asked to stop?
No. I was just saying you must check your battery because I heard your computer going off.
Oh, okay. Okay. The point I'm making here is that during this period that I've just covered now, you may well ask, what's happening to AZAPO? AZAPO was supposed to be the custodian of the Black radical tradition during this time. It was supposed to have been an heir apparent to the Black consciousness movement. At least we know what happened to the Soweto Students' League, which was a Black consciousness, movement student formation. We know what happened to it. But there seemed to be little said about what actually happened to AZAPO during this time. Let me just quickly point out here that, AZAPO was really desperately trying to find issues that it could be able to latch onto, and, kind of inspire Black people into, the kind of mass mobilization you would have had in the 1970s. And one of the issues that they actually took up was, in fact, to try to organize a boycott of the OJs. When the OJs visited South Africa, I think this was in 1977 or 78, or 78 actually. And that actually fell flat on its belly. But I think at some point we are going to discuss this. The one thing that really undermined AZAPO in the Black imagination was, in fact, the Kennedy visit to South Africa that was organized by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. AZAPO tried to organize a mass boycott, of the Kennedy visit, something that really affronted the Archbishop. And by that time, Bishop Desmond Tutu was actually picking up in terms of popularity. And, an affront to him would have been an affront to quite a sizable portion of the Black population. And that would have been one of the things that undermined AZAPO. But the other is what P.W. Botha himself did. If you think about the Black consciousness definition, it is for all those who were politically, culturally, and socially discriminated against. And that in itself was, a kind of a keenness to include colors and Indians. And what does P.W. Botha do? He attacks particularly that definition. He offers colors and Indians an opportunity to go into the national parliament as separate houses. The Indians, the House of Delegates, the coloreds, the House of Representatives. As it to be expected, this divides both the Indians and the coloreds. But the idea was to drag them away from the Black identity. But what happens with the Indian community at this time? It gets divided, no doubt. There are those who follow Rajbansi and go into the House of Delegates. And the coloreds too. There are those that follow Hendrikse, who was leader of the representatives, and they go into the House of Representatives. But the issue here is that what happens to those that does neither? They don't come back to Black consciousness. Instead, they join the UDF so that they see the UDF as an alternative kind of radicalism. So the point I'm making here is that, P.W. Botha, played it that way. He divided the Black consciousness movement by taking the colors and Indians away. It would have been quite encouraging had the segments of the Indian and colored communities who did not go into the P.W. Botha grand design stayed with AZAPO, but they didn't. Among the Indians, we only remember Srini Mudli, as having been one who stayed true to Black consciousness. I can't think of any other colored person, not even Peter Jones, who was arrested with Steve Biko, showed any inclination to be interested in Black consciousness thereafter. So the point I'm making is that, yes, he succeeded in separating colors and Indians from Black consciousness. But for Indians who thought that they could mask their moderation by going into what they said was a more radical formation, the UDF, this was not so. This was abandoning the Black radical tradition. So I think I want the viewers to understand that by 1990, the Black radical tradition has been subjected to so much systematic and, in fact, violent assault that it would be surprising that it survived. So when it re-emerges in the 2000s, we will have to explain what really happens there. Do we still have time? I don't know.
We have time. We have time for you.
Oh, okay. There are, okay.
I guess we moved it to 6 p.m. so that you could be comfortable and you can just.
Oh, yes.
Hey.
In fact, I was actually rushing, thinking that, we are approaching. Okay, no.
There's even some questions that you're going to answer. There's some questions I've put on the side, but you can continue. We've got time.
Can I take one? Can I take one quickly?
Yes, you may. Let me go to it now. They said, oh man. Okay, this one says, to what extent did the political intolerance of the 1980s undermine AZAPO?
Exactly what I've just said. In fact, I've actually tried to demonstrate that it was P.W. Botha's design to remove the colored and the Indian, demographics out of the Black mass movement, and he succeeded in doing so. But the point I'm making is that for those colored and Indian demographics, who did not go into P.W. Botha's design, the option would have been to remain in AZAPO, but they didn't. They actually opted to go into the UDF. They went into the UDF on the assumption that the UDF was a much more radical option than what AZAPO would have been. But, the UDF is a was in fact a non-racial formation. And part of what we need to explain here, I'm glad that I have time for this. Let me just go back to this and explain, how this actually happens, because it doesn't actually start with the immediate aftermath of Black Wednesday. The idea of creating an alternative kind of radicalism happens soon after the formation of SASO, the South African Students' Movement. What happens inside NUSAS is that some few members of NUSAS understand this kind of alienation that Biko has actually imposed on them and their exclusion from Black political affairs. Now, what do? They come up with a new phenomenon, and they refer to this phenomenon as the new radicalism. Now, the new radicalism is in fact a phenomenon of the liberals, the student moderate liberals that Black consciousness walked away from. But they themselves are walking away from their classical liberalism, and they are claiming that they are now more radical than the liberals. But what is it that they say makes them more radical? It is the fact that they understand the situation in South Africa to be, a problem of capitalist exploitation of labor and not of racism. So this becomes the new radicalism. Interestingly, This new radicalism builds up in the 1970s, while the mass movement is actually gaining momentum. They also are doing something on the sidelines. And to some extent, they may want to lay claim to involvement in what we refer to as the Durban moment of 1973, when there were work stoppages, in Durban. But then in 1976, they come up with the most ridiculous claim. I've just told your viewers that the one thing that concerned white society at this time was that the activities of June to December 1976 were conceived, planned, and executed by Black people alone, to the exclusion of all non-Africans. But in the new book called The New Radicals, they claim that one of them rode on a bike dressed in black on the 3rd of August, distributing pamphlets in Soweto. And I thought, this is a ridiculous claim, but that's the extent they will go to, to want to claim to have been part of this struggle. But clearly they were not. Now, let me come back to, to that issue. The issue here is that, yes, AZAPO was undermined. It was undermined by the UDF. And this was on the understanding that the UDF's kind of struggle was one, a non-racial kind of struggle. Therefore, the UDF, would have been a movement of all races. And true enough, it was. But secondly, that the UDF was actually involved in the struggle against capitalist exploitation of labor, and that explains the tripartite alliance. Now, this is the kind of new radicalism. How do we talk about it, or how do Black radicals actually talk about this radicalism in the South African context? This is a radicalism that is referred to as the radicalism of the white left. I've just accounted for how it penetrated, Black politics in the 1980s. It started in the immediate aftermath of the formation of the Black consciousness movement, projecting itself as an alternative radicalism. But it lay dormant throughout the 1970s. And come Black Wednesday, it resurfaces in the 1980s. It penetrates, the trade union movement, language and vocabulary. And already you begin to see that paradigm shift. And it is in this way that the vocabulary and language of AZAPO, becomes, it is actually marginalized. And the new language is the language of non-racialism, and it is the language of the relationship between the worker and the owners of the means of production. Now, you may wonder, how this was to be explained, in the townships, because if you're saying the antagonism was between, the owner of the means of production, the capitalist, and the worker, and you wanted to use violence as it happened in the 1980s, and you are unable to go to the capitalist because he lives in Sandton, you have to create, his image or his mirror image in the township and attack someone in the township as the capitalist. Now, how do we explain the attack on Maki Skosana? It's a complex kind of explanation that goes into it. The explanation is that essentially, what we are struggling against is capitalism and capitalist exploitation. But capitalist exploitation needs the state. And the state is therefore there, to support capitalist exploitation. But how does the state operate? The state uses, informers. It uses the police and it uses informers as well. So the informers actually become the state in the township. So that is how you validate attacking someone in the township, whether they be a Black policeman or whether they be a Black informer. But they become, an instrument of capitalism. Now, if you think people in the townships understood this, quite clearly they didn't, but rhetorically, that is how it was possible to execute, a lot of those missions. So, but all of this is actually happening under, P.W. Botha's watch. But what is it that finally triggers the 1984, event? It is what happens particularly on the East End. And fortunately, this time, it is not Soweto that is, at the forefront of what is going to happen next. Uh, Interestingly, between 1978 and 1983, it is generally understood that Soweto was going through a period of political quiescence. Now, political quiescence is nothing was happening politically in Soweto between 1978, in the immediate aftermath of Black Wednesday, and 1983. Nothing was happening in Soweto during that period. Someone wrote an article about it, and it was titled, "Why Was Soweto Quiescent During This Period?" This is something we are going to talk about when we address another, mechanism of P.W. Botha. And I just
But
mentioned,
Steve, that is Steve. Sorry to disturb you, and I didn't realize my mic was on. I hope I didn't disturb the audience. Before you leave, Maki Skosana, there's a question there that says, is acts of violence, the Maki Skosana necklacing in the 80s, linked to the violence we see in townships today?
This is precisely what I'm explaining. At the center of that, and I really want people to understand this. The issue here is that I talk about a paradigm shift, and maybe I really need to, specify what this is. This is a new political culture. It's a political culture that was evolving in the 1980s. The issue here is that the mass movement of the 1970s, I keep, emphasizing this. In certain ways, it was conceived and executed by Black people exclusively, and it was possible to come up with those kinds of things. But in the 1980s, it was completely different. The violence on Black people, the violence on the councillors in the Vaal, both in Sebokeng and Sharpeville, and the necklacing of Maki Sikhosana, they found a political validation, which is what I'm explaining now. You could find a political explanation that validates, the brutal violence visited upon Maki Sikhosana. I'm saying the culture that evolved out of the mass movement of the 1970s was such that it did not allow for that. It did not allow for that sort of violence to be visited upon the Black body. That is not something that was written anywhere, which is why I explained of the 1970s became a crucible of the Black consciousness philosophy. But the movement of the
Ngate Steve, I think there's something with your network. We seem to have lost the network of the guest, guys. Please don't worry. Hopefully he'll log off and log on again. I'm also going to tell them on the side.
Okay, let me quickly
Oh, there we go.
Tsitsi, let
Now
me
we
explain.
got, we couldn't hear you for the
let me
past.
explain.
Okay, we couldn't hear you for the past 2 minutes though, but okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay, let me just quickly go to it. Let me quickly, specifically with Maki Skosana, let me give people a clear sense of what happened here. I said, Soweto was not at the center of the movement of the 80s. In actual fact, soon after Black Wednesday, it was in fact townships on the East End that were rather restless. You had the East End Ratepayers Association. And I talked about the idiocy of Piet Korenhof, because he was the minister responsible for local affairs at that time. But on the East Rand and the Far East Rand, there was a lot of unrest related to local government matters, in the same way as you have service delivery issues today. And Pete Korenhoff kept making promises that he will fix things up, and he never did. In fact, the Sowetan started referring to him as Pete Promises, because he made promises that he actually never fulfilled. But it is, on the East Rand and Far East Rand where the pendulum was swinging to, away from Soweto. And the first township to erupt was actually the township outside Heidelberg, Ratanda. There was a great deal of unrest around 1981-82 in Ratanda. Then there was also the issue in Duduza, where Maki Sikhosana comes from. Let me follow that up, quite in detail, because it is important. In Duduza at the time, you had one big industry, John Deere, which was a manufacturer of tractors. And John Deere was the biggest employer, the largest employer of black labor in the area, including into Heidelberg, Ratanda. People worked there. Now, the other largest employer them in the workplace. So this is a situation where unrest from the township, would then spread into the workplace being John Deere and ESCO. Now, the massacre of Ngoye students in 1983 produced one student who actually came from Duduza himself. And he was also, initially active in COSAS, but he was a member of the local structures, youth structures in Duduza at that time. And by 1983, he was a student at the University of Zululand, and I happened to have a little discussion with him. Now, the massacre at the University of Zululand led to a closure of the university during 1984, and he probably went back to Duduza, but he was active, in the local structures. At some point, Maki Skosana came into contact with Almond Nofomela and Joe Mamasela. Now, these were the Ascaris, and I hope your viewers, the Ascaris are, people who went to exile, were probably, members of MK, came back into the country, were captured, were turned into, into sellouts and either deployed back or actually used, in the Black Township unrest that actually came out. So Almond Nofomela and Joe Mamasela were those kinds of Ascaris. Now, what they did was to befriend Maki Skosana, and one of them seemed to have had an intimate relationship with her. Unknown to Maki Skosana, these were actually Ascaris who were already working for Flag Plus, for Eugene de Kock at Flag Plus. And they were planted in Duduza specifically for purposes of luring the young guys and doing to them what they did to these three young guys. Now, what happened is that Maki introduced three youth leaders of Duduza to Almond Nofomela and Joe Mamasela. And these two were claiming to be MK cadres deployed back into the country. They promised to give them ammunition, landmines and bombs. They did. They brought hand grenades. But what they did was to booby trap the hand grenades. And when these guys tried to, hurl these at an ESCOM plant, the hand grenades exploded in their faces, and all three of them were killed. Now, when word went round in the township, it was clear Maki Skosana introduced Nofomela and Mamasela to these three guys. So the ruling was that she must have known about it, and therefore she was responsible. The funeral was quite a mass funeral. It was a massive funeral. And Maki's relatives and family said, there's talk in the townships, don't go to the funeral. But she insisted that, look, I'm not guilty. I didn't do this. I didn't know these guys were Ascaris. She went anyway. And that's when, the first necklace victim, that's when it happened to her. And I do recall that, you know, Archbishop Desmond Tutu was not far away and he tried to intervene, but it had been fait accompli, by the time he got there. So here is the justification that Maki Skosana was a state agent, and therefore a state agent should actually suffer that kind of a fate. Oh, yeah.
Yo, Tamaku. Tamaku. There's
Is
a
there any other
question, yeah?
question, or should we?
Yeah, I'm just going there. Barry, please deal with the impact of Dr. Melville Alexander on Black radical movements from Biko's passing onwards. Melville Alexander.
Yes, in fact, he's so central to it. Ntiki, there are ongoing lectures. There are annual lectures that are held, uh, to honor Dr. Neville Alexander. And, well, I don't have any problems with it, but his role, in this, particularly in this period, between 1980 and 1984, no doubt, it may have helped build up, the kind of theoretical and analytical, aspects of the mass democratic movement. He contributed, quite extensively in doing so. And I think for those people who may well be interested, I think the book to look at is titled Sow the Wind by Dr. Neville Alexander. But my first interaction with Dr. Alexander was at Funda Center in Soweto. And at the time, we were running a series of lectures. It was an initiative started by Professor Eskia Mpahlele. And again, this was an attempt, and Ziki at the time, and this was an attempt to
I don't think the system likes what we're talking about. Please be patient with us and the sound. Hopefully, Ntate Steve will come back. Yeah. Thank you to everybody contributing with the questions. They're so helpful. And I hope my mic is on. Please let me know in the comment section. At least now, at least I should be audible. Uh, there's that this Steve, something's happening. Uh-huh. Oh, okay. I see my mic is still on. Don't worry, guys. I'm just going to wait for him backstage. I'm sure he's logged off to log on again. Thank you to everybody commenting. The questions are so helpful. Oh, thank you, but I'm audible. Thank you for that. Thank you for the questions. Um, they help obviously with directing the conversation and me enjoying the lessons because you guys are asking the right questions. So thank you very much for making the job easier for us tonight. Still just waiting. We'll give it about 2-3 more minutes to see if he can log back on, but it shouldn't be a problem. I'm so glad you guys are enjoying these lectures. They're so nice, eh? They're so nice. Please remember that he's been on here. I'm sure this is the fourth or fifth one. So go to the Moya live stream section on YouTube to get the other lectures you might have missed out on. Um, there's also other amazing content on the Moya podcast. So please just do subscribe. We do need you. We need numbers. We need to grow. So please don't just watch there on Twitter. I know that's my main space, but please, where I really need you is on the YouTube. So if you can just subscribe on YouTube, Moya Podcast, there's some amazing, amazing episodes. And a reminder again, don't overlook the live stream section. It is hot. We even had Dr. Alan Busak the one time. You know, it is really, really quite something special. So, like, please, guys, join the Moya family, the Moya Rights. Thank you, Brad Steve. I'm so happy you're back. You
Okay,
were
I'm
at the
sorry about
part.
that.
No, don't
Yes,
worry. You were talking about Funda Center. You had just started
yes,
to talk about Funda Center.
yes. Like I said, I mean, SKM Patela was actually attempting to, reignite, the black radical tradition in South Africa at the time. And I'm talking about when in fact the interesting thing here is that when he came back into the country, he wanted to get a job at a university, and the first one he went to was the University of Zululand. And this little anecdote will explain what was happening in universities at this time in South Africa. So he went to the University of Zululand and talked to Professor Nkabinde, who was the vice chancellor at the time. But Nkabinde made it pretty clear that he wouldn't be able to employ him. And when Eskia came back, he said to us, Nkabinde is like a baboon tethered to a tree. So you can get a sense of what kind of vice chancellors he would have had, under PW at the time. And they were handpicked, they were actually handpicked to serve the purpose. But let's come back to Neville. Uh, Neville came in and, he had been to Robben Island. Ntsiki, last week or some time ago, you had an interview with Dr. Busak. And the issue here is that when we talk about the Black mass movement of the 1970s, Cape Town is a completely different, kettle of fish. Although, it did get drawn into it, you don't get a great deal of anecdotes about what was happening, in Cape Town and across the Western Cape, to the extent that you do get about black townships, in Gauteng. But that can be explained. And why I'm bringing this up is that Neville Alexander actually came out of that Cape tradition. No doubt there was a kind of a radical tradition in Cape Town. There is a movement that few black people know about, and it was called the Non-European Unity Movement. And, Neville would have been associated with the Non-European Unity Movement before he went to Robben Island. And when he came back, he was still within that tradition. Now, that was a Marxist-Leninist tradition that was, to be found in Cape Town. So when he came out of Robben Island, no doubt. I mean, Neville would have been more interested, in moving further afield, and he did. That's how we came to, host him at Funda Center. But the new paradigm that we are talking about, the new paradigm that those students from NUSAS said they were crafting, is the same paradigm that Neville Alexander was into, except that there's one little difference. And this is what the lectures about Neville Alexander are. They're actually held annually at UJ, and their understanding of Neville is that he did recognize the significance, of race in the race class debate. Because in the 1980s, the debate between black radicalism and the white left was precisely that. It was precisely what takes precedence over the other. Is it the race issue, which is a black radical issue, or is it a class issue, which becomes a Marxist-Leninist understanding, of the liberation struggle? Now, this is where the problem is, but it is also where, the whole phenomenon of black as absence actually happens, because to be able to engage in public, in the Marxist-Leninist, kind of an environment, you really need to have looked into it and understand. It's a kind of an esoteric. By that I mean intelligible only to those, who would have read about those kinds of things, surplus value, exploitation of labor by capital, alienation of labor. These are, I call them esoteric, kinds of concepts that are intellectual and academic. And, the issue is that even within the leadership of the mass democratic movement, I can tell you this for sure, more than 90% of them would have struggled, with coming to terms with this kind of political culture that they were immersed in. But Neville was at home. He was at home with that, kind of Marxist-Leninist analysis and theorization. And while he recognized the significance of race, he came up with what has been recognized even, in academic circles in the US, that he probably would have coined the term racial capitalism. But the term racial capitalism was also used by another great thinker, C.J. Robinson, in his book, Black Marxism, in the US. But each was not aware of the other's use of the term racial capitalism. But at some point, we may get an opportunity to just reflect a little, on what C.J. Robinson would have had in mind. But what Neville Alexander had in mind in the South African context was to project the class antagonism as the defining antagonism in the South African
That is
context.
Steve. Sorry,
Yeah.
I apologize. Can you explain to us what racial capitalism is?
Racial capitalism is, in fact, a concept that was coined by C.J. Robinson, and Neville Alexander also used this term. Nsiki, to explain this, it is in fact trying to deal with the dilemma of deciding which of the two is most important in the struggle in South Africa. Let's take South Africa as an example, because C.J. Robinson was actually writing for American audiences and academic, people interests. But let's look at South Africa and see what racial capitalism is. What the Black consciousness movement was saying is that the antagonism in South Africa is racial, meaning that the problem here is the problem of Black and white. The enemy of Black people is white people. The enemy of Blackness is whiteness. It is white supremacy. That was the mass mobilization of the 1970s. That's how the antagonism was understood. But in the 1980s, it became rather more complex. The term racial capitalism entered the political rhetoric. Neville Alexander was at the center of it. The one thing that comes out of the idea of racial capitalism is to again create or craft another, kind of category here and talk about Black labor. Now you are putting a racial identity to labor, and yet at the same time you want to argue that there is the universality of labor. Labor is universal, it knows no race. So what Neville Alexander was struggling with was to disaggregate the racial component of the South African antagonism from its class component, and at the same time advance the class component as decisive. Now, what is that? That becomes the white left and its systematic assault on Black radicalism. That's what it did, because what it did was to displace the Black radicalism of the Black townships of the 1970s and replace it with a radicalism that was conceived, crafted, and thought through by the white left, in the academic, lecture theaters at Wits and UCT and other white liberal institutions. This is what they were. And in fact, when you talk about community engagement in those universities, that's what it was about. It was about, spreading this kind of political rhetoric about the struggle being the struggle against capitalism. At the time at Wits, you had the Black student society, which in itself was seen as a kind of an anachronism, that you do not have blackness as an identity, dissolved this thing. And they dissolved it and they absorbed it into what became SASCO. The very people that who are in the public domain, would have been members of the BSS and subsequently, of SASCO, because, the new rhetoric was that. It was understand South Africa as not as, a terrain of racial antagonisms, but a terrain of class antagonisms. What that was, in fact, was obfuscation. It was hiding the fact that blackness and whiteness was actually at the center of the conflict in the 1980s. It is in this context, that AZAPO is completely smothered, unable to raise its head. In formal terms, actually, it was, again, it is also symbolic here that the last general conference that AZAPO had, that would lead to the formation of the UDF. Neville Alexander attended that conference. It was held in Hammanskraal at St. Peter's Seminary in Hammanskraal. And the issue of white participation in black struggles came up in that conference. And Neville Alexander was insistent on the fact that race is not the problem, but class is. And therefore, there is no problem in having white people becoming part of the mass movement. But that actually divided AZAPO into two. Those that followed Laibon Mabasa and Ishmael Mukabela and the others decided to stay with AZAPO. But those that embraced Neville Alexander, decided to go with Neville Alexander, and they formed the UDF, except that at some point very soon thereafter, Neville Alexander seemed to have been involved with what was called the National Forum. And, ultimately it just withered away. But yes, the issue here is that Neville Alexander's intervention, particularly, in the black townships in Gauteng. In the Cape, I still insist, that Marxist-Leninist tradition, was historically, it had been quite dominant, and it continued to be so. Despite the mass movement of the 1970s, it continued to be the dominant political ideology in the Western Cape, and in Cape Town in particular. But coming into the interior of the country, and particularly in Gauteng, that was the impact. The impact first was, moving into the creation of trade unions, changing the whole political rhetoric, and changing the whole understanding of the antagonisms in society, and finally forming the UDF, and coming up with the political rhetoric of non-racialism. The issue here is that it is in that those non-racial structures, that blacks, even though present, were rendered absent, and that whites, even though absent, would have been rendered present. Finally, this is a historical thing. It is not something that became an affliction of the ANC and its mass movement inside the country in the 1980s. I said the PAC left, the Africanists who formed the PAC left for the same reasons. Decision-making processes were passing on to non-Africans, and this rubbed them up the wrong way. For instance, if you think about it, rather than have, the preamble saying, Africa is Zwelethhu, Maibuye, you have the preamble saying, South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. That's a classical case of black as absence. What is absent there is Zwelethhu. What is present there is a white understanding of the fact that South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. That's the absence of black and the presence of white. It manifests itself yet again, soon after the Morogoro conference. The ANC came out and said, we came out revitalized out of Morogoro. But On the African continent, the perceptions were completely different. Someone commented when Joe Slobo was actually elected to the ANC's executive committee, someone commented that this is like a mess of black sheep being shepherded by a white sheepdog. But this was, in on the African continent, and that's how they understood, racial relations. But that was to be taken up by a group of people that the ANC also marginalized within itself, and these were the Africanists who still remained in the ANC after the PAC was formed. And the ANC, dubbed these guys the Gang of Eight. The Gang of Eight was actually the Africanists inside the ANC. By the time they were expelled in 1975, they had characterized, the ANC as Tambo's ANC, and distinguishing themselves, from the ANC of Oliver Tambo. Now, while in Zambia also, we have to actually bear in mind here that the ANC could be said to be Pan-Africanist because they embrace Kaunda. But you have to romanticize Kaunda to make him a revolutionary. So the ANC has actually done a pretty good job, romanticizing Kenneth Kaunda as a kind of a revolutionary. But in my view, and I think I can substantiate this, Kaunda would have been as much a Bantustan leader as Lucas Mangope would have been. The only thing is that he would have hosted the ANC, the MK, Zanla, Zipra, and every other liberation formation, movement on the subcontinent. No doubt he did that. But if you look at what Traore is doing today, I was actually listening to a tape where he was actually, lambasting the entire Western media and the West, and part of what you see in Traore is actually a modern day black radical. He's a modern day black radical to the extent that, he has that kind of determination to deal with the West. But as is the case in South Africa, the problem is when you embrace someone simply because of a kind of radicalism that they represent, if that radicalism is not black radicalism. And the Putin and the Xi Jinping radicalism is something that is not a subject of discussion today. Let it be a subject of discussion another time. And maybe Traore, over time, he may be able to learn, some lesson out of it. Nsiki, how much time do we have?
Oh, tonight we are very lucky because my usual 8 p.m. program is not on. So
Okay.
if you've still got information in you, you're welcome to go. People seem to be enjoying it. There are 477 of us in class at the moment.
Nsiki, any other question that I can respond to?
This one says, may Uncle Steve unpack a little bit, what he terms Pete W. Botha's total strategy.
Nsiki,
yes.
There are two aspects to total strategy. And the one aspect just about every South African is aware of. Flag Plus was part of total strategy. The violence of the apartheid securocrats was part of total strategy. That was the violent part of it. The murder of Griffiths Mxenge and his wife, the murder of the Craddock Four, and all the what we call extrajudicial murders, that they carried out, including the activities of Flag Plus and the Ascaris, the kind of brutal murders that these guys carried out was part of total strategy. And we'll talk about that violence. We don't have to take each one, of those incidents, but we'll give those that give you a general impression, of what the violence of total strategy was. So that was the one aspect of total strategy. But the most important aspect of total strategy is completely overlooked, in the history, in the literature, and that is an aspect that P.W. Botha himself was advised to adopt by the Americans. And, they had an acronym for it. It's called WHAM. WHAM is Win Hearts and Minds. Win Hearts and Minds was another strategy, one aspect of total strategy. The other was the violence. I'm going to explain how WHAM actually worked in creating a kind of a geography of class in Soweto that would impact on the mass mobilization of the 1980s. We will talk about that when we get to discussing that, the mass democratic movement of the 1980s. Was one part of WHAM. The other part of WHAM was, in fact, the creation, again in Gauteng here, but the idea is that that was replicated across the country, was to create apartheid, kind of teacher training institutions, to counter the missionary training, teacher training institutes. And what did P.W. Botha do? He created colleges of education. The impact of colleges of education on Black education was substantial and devastating. We are going to have to unpack that. We will talk about how that was actually accomplished. That would be one aspect of, win hearts and minds. Another would have been, in the universities, the kinds of interventions that, they had in the, apartheid securocrats introduced in the universities. The one culture that became predominant was a commitment to promoting Black mediocrity and suppressing Black talent. Now, that in itself was again a side attack, on Black radicalism. And I'm going to demonstrate, how this was actually achieved. You can actually see by the crop of Black academics, over the past 30 years, and you can see the point that I'm making, about apartheid state securocrats actually promoting Black mediocrity and suppressing Black talent. A great deal of it is actually very apparent on television and in the public space. Now, those are the twin elements, of what total strategy was about. But what did P.W. Botha tell South Africa? What did he tell the international community? And this is when, Tsiki, once again, I really want to answer that question. Is it the red or is it the swart gevaar that bothered white society? What P.W. Botha did was to give the impression that it is the radicalism of the white left that white society was to be afraid of. That's the impression he gave by saying that white society must be aware or be wary of a total onslaught that was borne by the ANC, that the ANC carried that total onslaught, while at the same time doing what I've just pointed out, reimagining the public sphere, attacking Black radicalism in the high schools, in the universities, in the workplace, even in cultural and sports bodies. There was a penetration of that too. The interesting thing that I often tell people is that before 1976, we had community theater. Credo Muta wrote a number of plays here that we went to see. Nosilimela, Ifindo, Gibson Kente, was every other week we would have a play by Gibson Kente. They may not have been political or had explicit political content, but they were a mirror of the Black race looking at itself. And that in itself was empowering and giving a sense of self-consciousness and a consciousness. That was problematic. That was also an area that had to be dealt with. And how was that dealt with? market theater was created as an alternative to that. So all of Black Township theater went to market theater. Now you cannot say that, in actual fact, I can boldly make the statement that the first production that went to market theater was in fact The Island. It was The Island, which was a depiction of life on Robben Island. And that was a play done by John Kani and Winston Nchona. It was a two-man play. And our objection to it was that, no, this is an appropriation of the Black cultural art forms. This is a new imperialism of the arts. But, today, Black society celebrates market theater. I don't blame Black people for not understanding the role of market theater in undermining a critical aspect of the Black radical tradition. So much investment went into the eradication of the Black radical tradition that nothing of it is left.
We've got to cut it. The battery's about to die.
Oh,
I hope
okay.
I've answered that question. I hope I've answered that question.
Yes, perfectly. Thank you for today's lesson. I don't want it to just cut in the middle. Thank you, Bra Steve. You're always amazing.
Okay.
We know what we learned today. We did the information scandal. We did Maki Skosana. We did
Yes,
non-racialism, black
I think let me just point this out. We are building
Uh-huh.
I think at this point we are between 81 and 85. We will understand total strategy in that period and what it achieves. But we will also understand how the white left, and that is important, the new radicalism of the white left did to the Black radicalism what it did. And the fact that we are what we are, precisely because our identities were forged outside our domain. If our identities were forged in the 80s, it was outside of the Black initiative. It was an imposition from outside. We would never have, like I said, Transformasono decided that Ntate Makaya can step down as the mayor. We would never have done to Ntate Makaya what those people in Sharpeville did to those councillors. There was a political validation of that act. I just want the viewers to understand this. The difference between the mass movement of the 1970s is that we owned it completely. Black people owned that movement. Black people did not own the movement of the 1980s. Neville Alexander and the others were probably part of reimagining the mass mobilized, the new radicalism. And that's the new radicalism that caught on. We'll talk about that maybe next time when we meet.
Beautiful. Next week, Wednesday, as usual, at 6 p.m.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Ndate Steve. You're the best. You are the Kana,
Okay, thanks.
when did you say your book? When is your book coming out and what is it called?
Ntiki, the title of the book is The Class of 76. A generation betrayed. It's the Class of 76 : a generation betrayed. And I'm not only talking about a generation inside the student movement that became Seiko. I'm also talking about the generation inside MK. I still feel Monty Mutloung was betrayed.
Beautiful. Hey, we can't wait to get all these stories. We love our Wednesdays. Thank you, Ndate Steve. And thank you to the crew. Thank you to the crew.
Thanks,
Sharp.
Okay, thank you.
Sharp, guys. Thank you.